Most people pray because they were taught that prayer is what good believers do. They pray before meals, before sleep, or when problems become too heavy to carry alone. But very few stop to ask, what actually happens when I pray? Does anything truly change inside me, around me, or beyond what I can see? Because if prayer is only words, then it becomes just another habit. But if prayer is communion, if it is an exchange between a living soul and the living God, then it is the most powerful act a human being can perform. I have learned through my years of ministry that God never ignores a sincere heart, but sincerity alone is not enough. Many speak to God with emotion, yet keep their will untouched. They cry, but they do not change. They ask, but they do not obey. And that is why so many prayers rise like smoke but carry no substance. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Isaiah 29-13. True prayer begins when the heart moves closer than the lips. It is not the length of your words, but the posture of your life that moves the unseen world. When your actions and your prayers begin to speak the same language, then everything starts to change. I remember a young man who came to me years ago. He said, "Pastor Cho, I pray every morning, but I feel nothing. It's like talking to an empty room." I asked him one question: "Do you speak to God, or do you speak at Him?" He looked confused, so I explained, "When you speak at God, you inform Him of your plans. When you speak to God, you invite Him to shape them. That is the difference between routine and relationship. And that difference is what determines whether the spiritual world remains silent or begins to move." The book of James says, "The effective prayer of a righteous person accomplishes much." James 5:16. Notice, not every prayer, but the one that comes from a clean heart and a surrendered life. When a person prays from that place, something changes, not first around them, but within them. Their mind becomes still. Their priorities are reordered. Their fears begin to lose control. And that transformation inside gives authority to everything they say afterward. Prayer is not about convincing God to act. It's about allowing God to align. Because when your heart walks in harmony with His truth, your words no longer compete with His will, they agree with it. That is where power begins, not in emotion, not in repetition, but in agreement with truth. So I ask you, when you pray, are you trying to change God's mind, or are you letting Him change yours? Because the moment you choose the second, the spiritual atmosphere around your life begins to shift. That's when prayer stops being something you do and becomes something you are. When a person begins to pray from a place of surrender, not pride, the entire structure of their life begins to realign. You may not hear thunder or see lightning, but something definite starts to happen. Order replaces confusion. Because prayer, at its core, is not an escape from reality, it is the reordering of it. When you pray with a clean heart, you invite the Spirit of God to rearrange what is out of place. Pride begins to lose its voice, fear begins to loosen its grip, and the confusion that once filled your thoughts starts to clear. That is the first sign that your prayer is touching spiritual ground. You see, prayer is not a way to pull God into your world. It is His way of pulling you into His. When you learn to pray this way, you begin to think differently, speak differently, and even desire differently. That is how the spiritual realm begins to recognize you, not because of what you demand, but because of what you've become. In the Gospel of John, Jesus said, "If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you." John 15:7. Notice His order: first abide, then ask. Because power is the fruit of proximity, you cannot release what you have not received, and you cannot receive what you do not dwell in. When you live close to the heart of God, prayer becomes more than a request. It becomes a continuation of His will through your voice. And that's when real authority begins to manifest. Think of Elijah on Mount Carmel. He didn't pray to impress the crowd. He prayed to confirm the truth, and because his life was already aligned with God before he ever spoke, the fire came down not as a display, but as recognition. The altar was ready, the heart was pure, the man was known. That's what changes in the spiritual realm: recognition. The unseen world begins to recognize your integrity, your consistency, your hidden life with God. Darkness retreats not because of your words, but because of the authority behind them. When your life is in order, your prayer carries weight. I often tell believers, the most powerful prayer is not shouted from the mouth, but lived from the heart. When you forgive someone who hurt you, the spiritual realm moves. When you confess what no one knows, the spiritual realm moves. When you obey when no one is watching, the spiritual realm moves. Because every act of obedience echoes louder than 1,000 declarations. Heaven measures your prayer not by how you sound, but by how you stand. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 6, "Go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen," because power begins in the hidden place, not the public one. When you live that way, your prayer becomes a signal, a recognized sound in the invisible, not of noise, but of authenticity. And the moment the spiritual world recognizes that sound, change begins to unfold, not by chance, but by divine alignment. When a person begins to pray from alignment, not emotion, the effects don't stay hidden for long. Something begins to shift in their environment. Peace replaces anxiety. Wisdom begins to guide what used to be chaos. It's not magic, it's maturity. You can always recognize when someone has been spending time in genuine prayer. Their voice becomes slower, calmer, not because they're passive, but because they have been in the presence of understanding. Their decisions stop being reactions and start being revelations. They forgive faster, they fear less, and they carry a quiet authority that cannot be imitated. That's what the Apostle Paul meant when he wrote, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Philippians 4:26. He wasn't talking about escaping problems. He was describing transformation through trust. Because prayer doesn't just change outcomes, it changes people. When you begin to pray this way, you will notice something. You stop asking for God to fix others and start asking Him to form you. And when He forms you, the world around you begins to adjust itself. Families reconcile when someone in that family starts praying with humility. Doors open when someone stops striving and starts surrendering. Bitterness melts when the soul finally bends. This is the true miracle of prayer, not that we control heaven, but that we are changed enough to reflect it. When you live this kind of life, your prayers carry peace into the places where others carry fear. They carry mercy where others carry anger. They carry light into conversations filled with darkness. You become an instrument of divine order. That is how the spiritual world measures power, by the degree to which your inner life mirrors the nature of God. When you walk in love instead of pride, you're already exercising authority. When you choose silence instead of revenge, you're already releasing power. When you pray for those who hurt you, you're already changing the atmosphere. And that kind of authority cannot be borrowed. It must be built, one act of surrender at a time. I remember once, during the early days of our ministry, a woman came to me desperate for her son's healing. She said, "Pastor, I've prayed for months, and nothing changes." I asked her gently, "Tell me, when you pray, do you ask God to heal your son, or to teach you how to trust Him even if He doesn't?" Tears filled her eyes, because she realized that prayer isn't about outcomes, it's about intimacy. That week, she stopped praying for control and started praying for surrender. And the peace that came over her was so powerful that it changed not only her son's condition, but the entire atmosphere of her home. That's what changes in the spiritual realm when you pray this way. You stop wrestling with God and start walking with Him. Your prayers stop being negotiations and start being conversations. And the result is not just power, it's presence. Because when the Spirit finds a heart that is still, honest, and obedient, He fills it with a strength that words can't explain. You may not see immediate results, but you will notice something deeper. You will not be the same person anymore. There is a moment in every believer's life when God stops waiting for more words and starts looking for truth. That moment usually comes when we realize that we can no longer live from borrowed faith or borrowed fire. We can't depend on someone else's prayers to sustain our spirit. We must return to the altar ourselves. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land." Notice the order again: humility before request, repentance before restoration. Prayer that changes the spiritual realm always begins in that place. It begins with brokenness. It begins when you admit, "Lord, I've been speaking more than listening. I've been asking for change without becoming willing to change." And the moment you say that with sincerity, heaven recognizes your voice again. Because the authority of prayer is born in the fire of surrender. You cannot command what you still serve. You cannot rebuke darkness if you secretly entertain it. You cannot pray for revival while resisting repentance. When a man or woman begins to live in holiness, in honesty, in humility, something sacred begins to return. Their prayer no longer feels heavy, their heart no longer feels distant. Because the distance between you and God is not measured in miles, it's measured in submission. Romans 12:1 says, "Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." In other words, before your prayer can carry power, your life must become an offering. That's when prayer stops being effort and becomes overflow. And when you live from that place, the spiritual realm recognizes you not as a visitor, but as a vessel. You won't need to chase signs or fight for proof. Your peace will become evidence. Your purity will become authority. Your obedience will become your greatest sermon. There is a silence in true prayer that speaks louder than 1,000 sermons. It's the silence of a surrendered heart. It's the place where you stop demanding and start depending. It's where you stop trying to be powerful and start being pure. When you pray from there, your voice carries something the world cannot imitate. Not emotion, but essence, not performance, but presence. You may be a mother praying alone for your children, a man fighting addiction, a leader weary from ministry, it doesn't matter. If your heart is honest, the Spirit recognizes it. And when He recognizes it, something begins to shift inside your home, inside your soul, inside your generation. Because God still listens to the voice that is broken, but faithful. He still responds to those who seek Him with clean hands and a steadfast heart. And though the world may not see it immediately, the change begins deep, quiet, and unstoppable. This is what truly changes in the spiritual realm when you pray this way. You stop being an echo and become a sound. You stop being a believer who repeats and become one who reveals. Your life becomes the message, your words become the confirmation, and your prayer becomes the bridge between heaven's truth and the world's need. So today, I don't invite you to pray longer. I invite you to pray truer, to rebuild your altar, to let your heart become the place where God's will finds a home again. Because when you pray this way with humility, purity, and surrender, everything changes, not just in the unseen world, but in the very core of who you are.